My husband signed the divorce papers on Christmas Day with the casual arrogance of closing a cheap deal. Across the table, his mother smirked, calling me a burden finally lifted. They expected tears. Instead, I slid a single cream-colored card toward the judge. It held no holiday greeting, only a raised seal that made the billionaire observer in the back of the room freeze in terror. They thought they were discarding me, but they had just handed me the weapon to destroy them. My name is Harper Sloan, and at 32 years old, I was spending Christmas morning in a sterile mediation room in downtown Philadelphia, watching my husband end our marriage with the same casual indifference one might use to cancel a gym membership. The room smelled of lemon floor polish and stale, burnt coffee. Outside the frosted glass walls, the city was quiet, settled into the holiday, but inside, the only sound was the aggressive scratching of Graham's fountain pen against the divorce decree. Graham Weller signed the final page and capped his pen with a sharp click. He looked up at me, a small, tight smile playing on his lips, devoid of any sorrow. It was the look of a man closing a profitable deal. Beside him, his mother, Eleanor, adjusted her pearl necklace and leaned in, her voice a theatrical whisper that was meant to be heard. Finally, we are free of that burden, Eleanor hissed, her eyes darting over my simple black dress with open disdain. I told you she would eventually know her place. Their lawyer, a man named Vance who wore a suit that cost more than my father's entire life savings, tapped the stack of papers on the mahogany table. He looked at me as if I were a smudge on the glass that he was eager to wipe away. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. Ms. Sloan, Vance said, his tone dripping with professional condescension. No alimony, no claim to future assets, no rights to the Northline Meridian shares. You leave with exactly what you came in with. Which, according to my files, is nothing. They waited for the tears. They expected me to beg or to scream about the 5 years I had spent curating Graham's image, managing his temper, and smoothing over his social blunders. Instead, I remained perfectly still. My hands rested on the table, covering a single, cream-colored envelope. I have no objections to the terms, I said, my voice steady. I slid the envelope across the polished wood toward the court clerk. However, I require this to be entered into the official record as a supplemental addendum. Graham chuckled, a dry sound. A Christmas card? Really, Harper, that is pathetic even for you. The judge, a tired man named Halloway who clearly wanted to be home with his grandchildren, sighed and reached for the envelope. He looked ready to toss it aside, likely assuming it was a desperate love letter or a plea for reconciliation. He pulled the card out. It was heavy stock, textured and expensive, with no holiday greeting. There was only a raised, embossed seal in the bottom right corner, a complex geometric crest that looked almost feudal. Judge Halloway frowned. He tilted the card under the harsh fluorescent light. Under the glare, a line of UV reactive ink shimmered into existence beneath the seal, revealing a serial code. The judge stopped chewing on the end of his glasses. His face went pale. He looked from the card to me, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the mediation room swung open. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A young man in a charcoal cashmere coat stepped inside, followed closely by 2 men in dark suits who moved with the precision of military personnel. It was Julian Hartley. Even Graham, who prided himself on knowing the city's elite, sat up straighter. The Hartley family did not just own real estate, they owned the banks that financed the real estate. Julian did not look at Graham or Eleanor. His sharp, predatory gaze was fixed on the document in the judge's hand. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor," Julian said. His voice was smooth, polite, and terrifyingly cold. I was alerted that a Level 1 registry document had surfaced in this building. "May I see that card for a moment?" Judge Halloway handed it over with shaking hands. Julian took the card. He ran a thumb over the embossed seal. His expression shifted from skepticism to a look of profound, dawning horror. It was the look of a man recognizing a weapon he thought had been lost to history. Eleanor, unable to read the room, let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she spat out. "Mr. Hartley, surely you didn't come all this way to watch her perform. It is just a piece of stationery from a craft store. She is trying to—" Julian lifted his head. He did not raise his voice, but the sudden intensity of his stare made Eleanor choke on her words. "Who allowed you to speak?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. He turned the card toward Graham and his mother, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges. "Do you have any idea what this is? Who allowed you to even touch this?" The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the ventilation system sounded like a roar. Graham looked confused, his arrogance faltering for the first time in 5 years. He looked at Julian, then slowly turned his head to look at me. I met his gaze. I did not smile. I did not blink. "You didn't just sign a divorce decree. Graham," I said softly, "you just divorced the only person who can freeze your entire career without ever laying a hand on you." 5 years before the courtroom door slammed shut, I was standing on a ladder in a converted warehouse in Fishtown, smelling of turpentine and cheap coffee. I was the program manager for Istro Atelier, a non-profit community art center. Graham Weller walked in wearing a suit that cost more than our annual grant budget, representing Northline Meridian to discuss gentrification synergy. He looked at me like I was a diamond in the rough that needed cutting. I did not realize then that cutting always involves removing parts of yourself. Graham spent the first year of our marriage systematically editing me. It started subtly. We would be at a dinner party with his partners, and I would start to tell a story about my students. Then I would feel at his hand on my knee under the white tablecloth. Not a caress, but a sharp, hard squeeze. It was his signal. "Stop talking. You are being too much." "Harper, darling," he would say, his smile tight and polite. "Nobody wants to hear about the inner-city zoning disputes tonight. Let's focus on the wine. Later, in the car." The critique would continue. My laugh was too loud. My dress was too bohemian. My friends were, in his words, quaint but ultimately useless. His family was worse. The Wellers treated life like a VIP lounge where admission was based on net worth. To his mother, Eleanor, I was never Harper. I was that girl who makes the little handmade cards. She said it with the same tone one might use to describe a toddler's finger painting. When Graham presented the prenuptial agreement a week before the wedding, his hands were shaking. He was terrified I would walk away from his money. He did not understand that I never cared about his money. "It is just to protect the family trust. Harper," he had said, sweating slightly. "It is standard procedure. No alimony, no claim to the business, just clean." "I understand," I said. I picked up the pen and signed my name without reading the fine print. I signed it because of Irene Sloan. My mother lived in a one-bedroom apartment in South Philly, surrounding herself with books and silence. She was a woman of secrets, a ghost in her own life. When I told her about Graham, she gave me advice that sounded paranoid at the time. "Do not let them love you for what they want to take." "Harper," she had told me, her voice raspy from years of smoking cheap cigarettes. "Let them think you are nothing. If they love you when you are nothing, then it is real. If they treat you like trash, then you know exactly who they are." So I became nothing. I became the quiet wife. For 5 years. Every Tuesday morning at 5 o'clock, I slipped out of our bed while Graham was still snoring. I told him I was going to a private yoga class in Rittenhouse Square. He never questioned it because he never looked at me closely enough to realize I did not own a single pair of yoga pants. I would return at 7, showered and dressed, just as he was waking up to check his stock portfolio. During those years, Graham's career at Northline Meridian skyrocketed. He believed he was a genius. Risky projects in the Navy Yard that had been stalled for months would suddenly get approved by the zoning board hours after he submitted a request. Funding gaps would miraculously close. He would come home, pouring expensive scotch, boasting about his killer instinct. I just have a feel for the market. Harper, he would say, admiring his reflection in the window. I walk into a room, and people just bend. He never asked why they bent. He never asked where I went on Tuesdays. Then came Celeste Rowe. She was a public relations consultant hired to polish the Northline brand. She was everything I was not: loud, expensive, and desperate for attention. I found the hotel receipt in his jacket pocket while taking it to the dry cleaners. Then I found the second one. Then the texts. I did not scream. I did not throw a vase. I opened my laptop and created a new folder titled Evidence. I logged dates, times, and credit card transactions. I watched him lie to my face over dinner, and I felt my love for him turn into a cold, hard stone in my chest. The end came 3 days before Christmas. My mother, Irene, passed away in her sleep. It was sudden and quiet, just like her life. I called Graham from the hospital, barely able to speak through the grief. I have a board meeting, Harper, he said, his voice impatient. I cannot just leave. Send flowers for me. Something tasteful. He did not come to the funeral. He sent a generic wreath of white lilies with a printed card that his secretary had clearly ordered. I stood by my mother's grave in the freezing rain, looking at that hollow, plastic-looking wreath. That was the moment the last thread snapped. The test was over. I went home, dried my eyes, and waited for him to serve me the divorce papers he had been hiding in his briefcase. Merry Christmas, Graham, I whispered to the empty house. You have no idea what you just lost. The Weller estate in Bryn Mawr was draped in thousands of white lights, looking less like a home and more like a fortress of ice. Inside, the dining room was suffocatingly warm, smelling of roasted goose and expensive pine. This was supposed to be a Christmas dinner, but as I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, it became clear that this was actually a public execution. Graham stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. The sound rang out sharp and clear. I have an announcement, Graham said, his face flushed with wine and victory. He did not look at me. He looked at his parents. Harper and I have decided to part ways. The papers were finalized this morning. I am entering the new year as a single man. He said it with the same tone one uses to announce a promotion or a successful merger. There was no silence, no shock. His father nodded approvingly, slicing into his steak. About time. His father grunted. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, smiled a tight, predatory expression. She reached under the table and pulled out a small, beautifully wrapped box tied with gold ribbon. She slid it across the table toward me. I have one last gift for you, Harper, Eleanor said sweetly. Open it. I untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. The box was empty. It is a decorative box, Eleanor explained, sipping her champagne. You can take it with you as a souvenir. Since you always loved making little crafts, I thought an empty decoration suited you perfectly. Pretty on the outside, but absolutely nothing of value inside. Across the table, Graham's younger sister, Chloe, held up her phone. The flash blinded me for a second. She was already typing, her thumbs flying across the screen. Moments later, my phone buzzed in my purse. A notification from Instagram. Chloe had posted the photo of me sitting alone with the empty box. The caption read, "Starting fresh. No dead weight." Graham sat back down, loosening his tie. He looked at me with a performance of pity that was more insulting than his mother's cruelty. Look, Harper, he said, I am not a monster. I will let you keep the sedan. It has high mileage, but it runs. Consider it a humanitarian contribution to your new life. The table erupted in polite, cruel laughter. They were enjoying this. They were feasting on my humiliation. I did not touch the empty box. Instead, I reached into my small clutch and pulled out the card I had made 3 days ago. It was heavy, cream-colored cotton paper, cut with surgical precision. In the corner, the embossed seal I had pressed myself caught the candlelight, a complex, geometric design that looked like a tangled knot. I placed it gently on the table next to my wine glass. The laughter died down, replaced by confused sneers. "What is this?" Graham asked, picking up his glass again. "Are you handing out Christmas cards now, or is there a request for money inside?" "Just open it," I said softly. Graham waved a hand dismissively. "I do not need to read your sob story." "Harper." I took a pen from my purse. I opened the card myself. The paper was blank inside. With a steady hand, I wrote 6 words in the center of the page. "Merry Christmas." You signed it. I closed the card and left it on the table. Then I checked my watch. It was exactly 9 o'clock at night. The system update I had scheduled weeks ago would be rolling out right now. "I am leaving," I said, standing up. "Enjoy the house. Graham." It always did have terrible insulation. I walked out of the dining room, leaving the card sitting there like a landmine waiting to be stepped on. As the heavy front door closed behind me, I heard them laughing again. That laughter was the last sound of their old life. Later that night, Graham received an email on his encrypted work phone. The subject line was simply "System Alert." The body of the email contained 2 words, "Access updated." He likely glanced at it, assumed it was a standard IT maintenance glitch, and went to sleep dreaming of his freedom. The next morning, the reality set in. At 8 o'clock, Graham walked into the lobby of the Northline Meridian Tower. He waved at the security guard and pressed his badge against the scanner for the executive elevator bank. The light on the scanner did not turn green. It flashed a harsh, angry red. He tried again. "Red." "Hey, Jerry," Graham shouted to the guard, annoyed. "My badge is acting up. Buzz me in." The guard looked down at his console, then back at Graham. The man's face was pale. I can't. "Mr. Weller," the guard stammered. "The system says your credentials have been revoked. It says you are listed as a trespassing risk. That is ridiculous." Graham snapped. "I am the Vice President of Development." "Not according to the screen. Sir," the guard said, pointing to the monitor. "It says your clearance level is 0. Graham stood in the lobby, his expensive briefcase heavy in his hand, as the employees he used to terrorize walked past him to the elevators. He was locked out. And somewhere in the city, I was sipping black coffee, watching the digital logs confirm that the first domino had officially fallen. 2 days before the final mediation session, I walked into the hushed oak-paneled offices of Heron and Blythe. This was not the kind of law firm that advertised on billboards. This was the kind of firm that handled problems that did not officially exist. My mother's estate attorney, a woman named Mrs. Sterling, who looked like she was carved out of marble, slid a thick, wax-sealed envelope across the desk. It was the final bequest from Irene Sloan. Inside this envelope is the activation documentation for the Omnia Trust. "Mrs. Sterling said, her voice low. "There is a specific clause regarding the transfer of control. We call it the 72-hour protocol. If the beneficiary undergoes a significant legal status change, such as a divorce, the assets must be publicly declared or immediately frozen." I reached for the envelope, but Mrs. Sterling placed her hand over it. "You do not take the papers to court. Harper," she instructed. "The papers stay in our vault. You take the authenticator." She handed me the cream-colored card with the embossed seal. To the untrained eye, it was just heavy stationery. To the systems that ran the global financial markets, it was a physical cryptographic key. "This card is the only thing that validates the claim," Mrs. Sterling said. "Without it, the papers are just paper. With it, they are a command." Back in the courtroom, the silence was still ringing in the air after Julian Hartley's question. Julian had not walked into that room by accident. I learned later that he had been hunting a ghost for 3 years. His analysts at the Hartley Group had noticed a massive, silent block of voting rights within Northline Meridian's parent company, Umbra Holdings. They called it the Dark Block. It was powerful enough to veto board decisions, yet nobody knew who held it. Julian had tracked the digital footprint to this courthouse, to this specific docket number. He was not looking for a woman. He was looking for the Sloan Registry. The seal on my card was not just a design. It was the mark of the Sloan Registry, a defunct but legendary verification system used by old money families to secure assets in shell companies. It was a system designed to be invisible until it wanted to be seen. Julian stepped closer to the table, ignoring the sputtering protests of my mother-in-law. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign that I was a proxy or a pawn. "Do you know what you are holding?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. I looked at him. I know it makes people quiet. Julian's lips twitched, almost a smile. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice projecting authority. "I am requesting permission to act as an independent monitor to verify the authenticity of this document." Vance, the Weller family lawyer, stood up, buttoning his jacket aggressively. "This is absurd," Vance scoffed. "It is a Christmas card, Your Honor. The woman is clearly unstable. She is trying to delay the proceedings with arts and crafts. There is no evidence here." "Then you should have no problem letting me look at it," Julian countered smoothly. He turned to me. "If I verify this, I would like a private conversation with you immediately following this session." I nodded once. Agreed. Julian took a small, specialized UV light from his pocket, a tool used to detect counterfeit currency and high-level forgeries. He shone it over the embossed seal. The room watched in breath-held silence. Under the blue light, the seal did not just glow. It projected a complex holographic pattern onto the table surface, a web of interlocking lines that formed a perfect, unbreakable chain. Julian clicked the light off. He looked at Graham, who was staring at the table with his mouth slightly open. "The document is valid," Julian announced. "And Mr. Weller, you should know that this is not just a notification of ownership." "What is it?" Graham demanded, his voice cracking. "It is a trigger mechanism," Julian explained, his tone devoid of sympathy. "This card is linked to the Northline Meridian corporate governance server. The moment you signed that divorce decree, you validated the second half of the security key. You did not just divorce your wife, Graham. You just authorized the transfer of 51% of the voting rights in your own company to her. It is done. The board is hers." Julian ushered me into a small, soundproof conference room adjacent to the judge's chambers. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive cologne. He did not pull out a chair for me, nor did he offer water. Instead, he walked to the glass table and laid out a large schematic drawing of a corporate structure. He smoothed the edges with a precision that felt less like a business presentation and more like a general laying out a map of a war zone. "You think you just acquired a seat on the board of Northline Meridian," Julian said, his voice low and devoid of pleasantries. "You are wrong." He tapped a small box at the very top of the pyramid chart. "Northline is just a subsidiary," he continued. "It is the public face. But the spine of the beast, the entity that holds the land deeds, the intellectual property, and the financing, is a shell company called Umbra Holdings. It has been dormant and ownerless for a decade, waiting for a biometric key." He looked up at me, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Graham Weller did not just divorce his wife," Julian said. "He just handed the keys of Umbra Holdings to the only person he thought was too stupid to use them." I looked at the chart. I felt a strange calmness settling over me, the kind that comes after a violent storm. "I never wanted to steal anything," I said quietly. "My mother." She told me to live simply. She said if I lived without the trappings of wealth, I would see who truly loved me for me. I just wanted to know if Graham was real. He was not, Julian replied instantly. But that is irrelevant now. The Wellers are not just arrogant. Harper. They are hiding something inside Northline. You have walked into a snake pit. If you are not careful, they will bite before you can stomp on them. I leaned over the table, scanning the list of strategic initiatives listed under Graham's name on the chart. My breath hitched. There, printed in bold black letters, were titles like the Urban Canopy Project and the Microgrid Community Integration. These are mine, I whispered, my finger hovering over the paper. I drew these plans on napkins at dinner. I explained the zoning logic to him while he was driving. He told me they were cute. He told me they were impractical fantasies. And then he presented them to the shareholders as his own genius innovations. Julian finished for him. He built his reputation on your mind, while telling everyone you were nothing. The anger that flared in my chest was not hot. It was freezing cold. It clarified everything. I want to burn it down. I said, "No." Julian cut in sharp. "That is exactly what they expect. If you act like a scorned ex-wife, they will bury you in litigation. They will paint you as hysterical and emotional." He stepped closer, invading my personal space just enough to make his point. We were close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. There was no romance in his posture, only the electric tension of a shared secret. "I can offer you the full resources of my legal team and my forensic accountants," Julian said, "but I have one condition. We keep this clean. We do not use his adultery. We do not use his cruelty. We use data. We use contracts. We use system logs. We destroy him with the one thing he cannot manipulate, the truth." I looked at him. I thought of Celeste Rowe and the hotel receipts I had saved. Then I thought of the empty Christmas box Eleanor had given me. Agreed. I said, "No drama, just numbers." Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, hexagonal device made of black metal. He placed it on the table between us. "This is a biometric reader linked to the Sloan registry," he explained. "If you are truly the heir, your thumbprint will unlock the digital vault. If you are not, it will brick the system permanently." I did not hesitate. I reached out and pressed my thumb against the glass surface. A soft blue light pulsed once, then twice. A holographic projection flickered into the air, displaying a scrolling list of assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But then, the text turned red. A warning box popped up in the center of the projection. Julian leaned in to read it, and for the first time, he looked surprised. "Well," Julian murmured, "your mother was a very clever woman. What does it say I asked?" "It is a safeguard clause." Julian read, "The Vendetta Protocol. It states that while you have ownership, your voting rights are subject to a probationary period. If the board can prove that any of your executive decisions are motivated by personal malice or emotional distress, your control will be suspended for 12 months. He looked at me, a challenge in his eyes. "It means you cannot just fire Graham because you hate him," Julian said. "You have to prove he is incompetent. You have to prove he is a criminal. You have to be ice cold." "Harper, can you do that?" I looked at the projection, then back at the door where my husband was currently panicking. "Watch me," I said. The following morning, I transformed the conference room at the law firm into a war room. I hired Graybar Forensics, a team of auditors who were known for being expensive and utterly ruthless. They did not care about corporate politics or feelings. They only cared about the math. I do not want rumors. I told the lead forensic accountant, a man named Silas with wire-rimmed glasses and tired eyes, "I want the data trails. Follow the money and follow the digital signatures. If a single penny moved without a receipt, I want to know where it went. For the next 48 hours. We lived on takeout coffee and silence, broken only by the clicking of keyboards. The picture that emerged was not just ugly, it was criminal. Graham had not just been making risky deals, he had been fabricating reality. He is pulling revenue from future quarters into the current one, Silas said, pointing to a spreadsheet projected on the wall. Look here. He booked the projected rental income from the Navy Yard project as liquid cash for this fiscal year. That is illegal. He is inflating the company value to trigger his performance bonuses. What about the occupancy rates, I asked. Falsified, Silas replied flatly. He claims 90% occupancy in the residential towers. The utility usage data suggests it is barely 40%. He is paying the maintenance costs out of the capital improvement budget to hide the losses. Then came the email. One of the junior analysts recovered a deleted thread from Graham's private server. It was dated 6 months ago. The subject line was obstruction. In the email, Graham had written, "We need to find a way to bypass the V-seat. The anonymous observer blocks every high-yield risk I propose. Whoever sits in that chair is a coward who hates progress." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. The V-seat. The vesting seat. That was the anonymous board position held by the Umbra Trust. That was me. For 5 years, Graham had been ranting about an invisible enemy who thwarted his reckless schemes, never realizing that he was complaining about the wife he was sleeping next to. He had called me a coward while I was the only thing keeping him out of prison. He could not have done this alone, I said, turning to Julian, who was reviewing a stack of printed logs. Graham is arrogant, but he is not sophisticated enough to hide these losses in the ledger. He had help, Julian confirmed. He slid a file toward me. Meet Marcus Dane, the regional chief financial officer. I opened the file. Marcus Dane was a man I had met once at a Christmas party. He was quiet, unassuming, and always smiling. But the logs showed a different story. Every time the automated system flagged one of Graham's transactions as high risk, Marcus Dane had manually entered an override code. He was the gatekeeper who kept unlocking the doors Graham should have been barred from. "We need more," I said. "We have the numbers, but we need the intent." I authorized the activation of a third-party whistleblower channel. It was a secure, anonymous portal where employees could report misconduct without fear of retaliation. I sent the link to the entire company directory under the header of the new independent audit. I expected it to take days. The first ping arrived in 20 minutes. It was not about Graham. It was about Eleanor. "Read this," I said, my voice shaking slightly. The tip came with an attachment, a scanned invoice. It showed a transfer of $50,000 from the Weller Family Charity Foundation to a consulting firm owned by Celeste Rowe. The description listed it as event planning services, but the date coincided exactly with a series of negative press articles that had been planted about Northline's competitors. "She is using charity money to pay for his mistress," I whispered, "and she is using the mistress to sabotage the market." Julian stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Philadelphia skyline. "You realize what this means, Harper," he said. "This is not just about a bad husband. If you pull this thread, the whole tapestry unravels. If you expose the charity fraud, the IRS gets involved. If you expose Dane, the SEC gets involved. If you take down Graham, you take down the entire family. They will fight you with everything they have. Let them fight," I said, closing the file. "If the system is this rotten, it deserves to collapse." "And what happens when it falls on top of you?" Julian asked. "Then I will build a new system," I replied. "One that actually works." Just then, Silas called out from his station. "Ms. Sloan, you need to see this. We just correlated the override dates with Graham's promotion timeline." I walked over to the screen. The data points formed a clear, undeniable pattern. Graham's lucky breaks, the projects that got approved at the last minute. The funding that appeared out of nowhere were not luck. They were coordinated. Every time Graham was about to fail, Marcus Dane stepped in to save him, and immediately after, Graham would receive a promotion. He is not a mastermind, I realized, a wave of nausea hitting me. He is a puppet. "Exactly," Julian said. stepping up beside me. Graham thinks he is the golden child, but looking at this, he was selected. Someone higher up wanted a reckless, ambitious fool in that seat, someone who would sign anything put in front of him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Graham was not the villain. He was the weapon. And for the first time, I wondered who was actually holding the handle. The war did not start with a scream. It started with a phone call at 7 o'clock in the evening. My phone buzzed on the mahogany conference table. The caller ID flashed Eleanor Weller. I put it on speaker so Julian could hear. "Harper, darling." Eleanor's voice floated through the room, dripping with a sugary, manufactured warmth. I was thinking, this whole court business is so messy. Why do you not come over for dinner tonight? We can talk like adults. Graham is ready to apologize. It was a trap. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. She did not want peace. She wanted proximity. She wanted to look me in the eyes to gauge exactly how much I knew about the charity fraud and the money laundering. I am afraid my calendar is full. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice flat, "but tell Graham he can save his apology for the deposition." I hung up. Julian looked at me with a grim expression. "They are scared," he said, "and scared people bite." He was right. While we were sifting through data, the Wellers were launching a counteroffensive. Within 3 hours, Graham's panic had turned into a coordinated PR strategy. Through the surveillance logs from the company server, we reconstructed their movements. Graham had rushed to Celeste Rowe's apartment, pacing her living room floor. "She played me," Celeste Graham had shouted, according to the audio from his own phone, which he had unknowingly synced to the company cloud. "She is not just some housewife. She is a Sloan. She hid billions from me. She tricked me into signing that divorce paper so she could ruin me. We need to spin this. Now." By the next morning, the narrative had shifted. An anonymous article appeared in the Philadelphia Financial Journal. The headline screamed, "The Shadow Mistress: How a Billionaire Heiress Manipulated Northline Management." The article painted me as a vindictive, unstable woman who had deceived her husband about her identity for years, only to use her family money to destroy his hard work during a personal breakup. The stock price of Northline Meridian dipped by 4% before the market even opened. The internal message boards were on fire with rumors. But the Wellers were not just fighting in the press. They were fighting in the legal gray zones. Eleanor, proving she was the true mastermind, had secretly met with Marcus Dane, the corrupt CFO. They knew I was coming for them, so they built a legal wall. At 10 o'clock, a courier delivered a formal notice to my office. Graham had filed an official internal whistleblower complaint against me. "He is accusing you of a hostile workplace environment due to personal conflict of interest," Julian explained, reading the document with a scowl. "He claims you are using your new voting power to enact a personal vendetta against an ex-spouse. Under the corporate bylaws that Marcus Dane conveniently updated this morning, this complaint triggers an automatic freeze on all disciplinary actions against Graham until an external review is conducted." I felt the blood rush to my face. "So I cannot fire him if you fire him now. While this complaint is active, you prove his point," Julian said. "It triggers the vendetta protocol in the trust. You will lose your voting rights for 12 months. They have checkmated you, Harper. They found the one way to keep him in his seat." I stood up, pacing the room. "So he gets to stay. He gets to keep stealing because he filed a complaint saying I am mean. He gets to stay if you fight him like an ex-wife," Julian said. His voice was sharp, cutting through my anger. "Stop looking at him as the man who cheated on you. Look at him as a line item. Don't fire him for being a bad husband. You cannot touch him for that. But you can destroy him for being a bad employee." I stopped pacing. I looked at the map of the company on the wall. Julian was right. I had to stop reacting to the drama and start reacting to the data. "We changed the strategy," I said, turning to the team of forensic accountants. "No more press releases. No more legal threats. Tomorrow morning, I am calling a mandatory meeting for all department heads. We are not going to talk about the divorce. We are not going to talk about the investigation. What are we going to talk about? Silas asked. We are going to have a quarterly performance review, I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. We are going to put Graham's numbers on the big screen and ask him to explain the math in front of the entire company. Meanwhile, across the city, the cracks in the Weller alliance were beginning to show. We received a flagged email from Celeste Rowe's account. She had forwarded the draft of the PR statement to her personal lawyer. In the draft, Graham and Eleanor had carefully phrased the defense to place the blame for the accounting errors on external consultants. Celeste was reading the fine print. She realized that if the ship went down, the Wellers were not planning to offer her a life raft. They were planning to handcuff her to the anchor. They are going to sacrifice her, I murmured, reading the intercepted log. And when she realizes that, Julian said, she will be the one to hand us the knife. Graham made his fatal mistake at 9 o'clock in the morning. In a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, he filed an emergency motion for a prohibitory injunction, claiming that my investigation was a breach of corporate privacy and spousal harassment. He thought this would seal the records. He did not realize that by bringing the matter to open court to argue for the injunction, he had just made every piece of evidence I submitted a matter of public record. We fought on two fronts simultaneously. While Julian represented me in the courtroom, I stood in the main auditorium of Northline Meridian, facing 200 confused and anxious employees. I did not bring a speech. I brought a projector. In the courtroom, Graham's lawyer was shouting about my vindictive agenda. She is using her newfound status to humiliate my client, Vance argued, his face turning red. This is a domestic dispute masquerading as a corporate audit. We demand all evidence be stricken. But in the auditorium, I remained silent. I nodded to Silas, the lead forensic accountant. He pressed a button, and the massive screen behind me lit up. It was not a slide of accusations. It was a slide of raw server logs. The report you see on the left is what Mr. Weller presented to the shareholders last quarter, Silas announced to the silent room. It claims an occupancy rate of 85% in the Navy Yard towers. The data on the right is the actual keycard usage logs. The real occupancy is 32%. A gasp rippled through the room. Back in court, Julian stood up. He did not look at Graham. He looked at the judge. Your Honor, the defense claims this is a personal vendetta based on a marriage, Julian said calmly. We are not submitting a single text message or email regarding their relationship. We are submitting 300 pages of altered revenue reports, unauthorized wire transfers, and invoices for non-existent maintenance repairs. This is not a divorce case. It is a crime scene. At the Northline headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to anger. I watched the faces of the department heads. They were realizing that their budgets had been cut not because of the market, but because the money was being siphoned off. Suddenly, the head of design, a quiet man named Elias, stood up. He was staring at a specific email chain on the screen where Graham had claimed credit for the sustainable microgrid concept. That is my design, Elias said, his voice shaking. He told me the board rejected it. He told me it was too expensive. Then he put his name on it. He did not just put his name on it, I answered, speaking for the first time. He used it to secure his year-end bonus while denying your team the funding to build it. The dam broke. Another manager stood up. Then another. They began to shout out instances where Graham had stolen work, erased names, or forced them to sign off on false data. In the courtroom, Graham was losing his composure. She is lying, Graham screamed, ignoring his lawyer's attempt to silence him. She is a fraud. She lied about who she was for 5 years. She is posing as a Sloane just to trap me. Judge Holloway looked down over his spectacles. He looked tired of the theatrics. Mr. Weller, the judge said, his voice cutting through the noise like a gavel. You claim she deceived you about her identity. Let me ask you a simple question. In 5 years of marriage, did you ever once ask your wife who she actually was, or were you too busy telling her who she should be? Graham froze, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Eleanor tried to salvage the moment. She stepped forward, clutching a handkerchief, playing the role of the distraught mother. Your Honor, please, she sobbed theatrically. My son is under immense stress. This woman is attacking our family legacy. We have done so much good for this city through our charity. Regarding that charity, Julian interrupted, holding up a flash drive. We have just received a submission from a witness named Celeste Rowe. Graham's head snapped around. Eleanor went pale. Julian played the audio file. It was a recording taken inside a car. Graham's voice filled the courtroom, clear and undeniable. We need to crash the stock price. Celeste, I will leak the bad quarterly numbers early. It will force Harper to settle for cash just to save the company value. We tank it, she sells, and then we buy it back cheap. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Conspiracy to commit securities fraud. It was over. Back at Northline, the final blow landed. I signaled Silas to display the last piece of evidence. It was an email thread regarding the unauthorized overrides of the safety budget. The screen displayed a message from a private server. The subject line was, "Move the funds again." The sender was not Graham. It was Marcus Dane. I looked across the auditorium. Marcus Dane was sitting in the front row, his legs crossed, looking bored. But as his name appeared on the screen in 10-foot-tall letters, every head in the room turned toward him. "Mr. Dane," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing off the walls. "Would you like to explain to the shareholders why you authorized the transfer of $2 million from the Structural Safety Fund into a shell account in the Caymans on the same day Graham Weller received his promotion?" Marcus Dane stopped smiling. He looked at the screen, then at the exits, realizing that for the first time in his life, there was no override code that could save him. Marcus Dane was a cockroach in a bespoke suit, and like any survivor, he knew exactly how to scurry into the cracks when the light turned on. An hour after the confrontation in the auditorium, a process server slammed a thick stack of documents onto the conference table. Motion to dismiss, based on illegal surveillance and privacy violation, Julian read aloud, his brow furrowing. Dine is arguing that you accessed his private servers without a warrant. He is trying to get all the evidence thrown out as fruit of the poisonous tree. And he is accusing you of using the board's resources for a personal vendetta. On the table, the hexagonal biometric device hummed. The holographic projection, usually a calm blue, shifted to a warning amber. A text box pulsed in the air. Conflict of interest detected. Vendetta protocol active. Time to lock out 48 hours. I stared at the counting timer. The trap was armed. If I continued to lead the investigation, the trust would view it as an emotional abuse of power and strip me of my voting rights for 12 months. Dane and Graham had found the one weakness in the system, my own anger. "You have to pull your hand off the trigger." "Harper," Julian said, his voice urgent. "If you fire them, you lose the company. You have to hand the investigation over to an independent committee. You have to make yourself powerless to stay in control." It felt like surrender. I looked at the map of the company I had fought so hard to protect. Then, without a word, I picked up a pen. I signed the order recusing myself from all disciplinary decisions, effectively sidelining myself in my own war. Graham heard the news within minutes. He burst into the conference room, his lawyer Vance trailing behind him like a nervous shadow. Graham looked disheveled, but there was a new, manic glint of triumph in his eyes. "I knew you would fold," Graham sneered, tossing his badge onto the table. "You never had the stomach for the big leagues. Harper, I accept your retreat. I am willing to resign, effective immediately." "We accept your resignation," Julian said calmly. "Good," Graham said, smoothing his tie. "Then let's talk numbers." My contract stipulates a severance package of $5 million, plus the immediate vesting of all remaining stock options. Cut the check, and I will be out of your hair by noon. He stood there, hand extended, expecting a check. He truly believed that even in defeat, he was entitled to a victory lap. I opened a leather-bound folder that Graybar Forensics had retrieved from the physical archives. I pulled out a single yellowed sheet of paper. I do not need to cut you a check. Graham, I said softly. Because of this. I slid the paper toward him. It was an amendment to the Executive Employment Agreement, dated 3 years ago. At the top, in bold letters, it read the Weller Clause. Do you remember this? I asked. You went on a crusade to purify the company culture. You gave speeches about integrity. You insisted on a clause that punished dishonesty with absolute severity. Graham stared at the paper. His face went gray. Section 8, Paragraph 4. I recited from memory. Any executive found to have manipulated key performance indicators or financial data for the purpose of inflating bonus payouts shall forfeit all severance, all unvested stock, and all retroactive bonuses for the affected period. Graham stopped breathing. The silence in the room was deafening. He had signed this. He had championed this. He had built the guillotine that was now hovering over his own neck. You can't enforce this, Graham stammered, his voice sounding very small. This was just for the junior managers. It was never meant for you, I finished. The contract does not say junior managers. Graham, it says all executives. Who put this in here? Graham yelled, looking at his lawyer. Why did I sign this? Because your mother told you to, I revealed. Graham froze. I found the meeting notes. I continued, my voice cold. Eleanor insisted on this clause. She told the board it was necessary to prevent outsiders from marrying into the company and looting it from the inside. She thought she was setting a trap for me. Graham. She thought I would be the one trying to cheat the system. She never imagined her golden son would be the thief. Graham sank into the chair, the fight draining out of him instantly. He looked at the paper, then at me. The realization hit him like a physical weight. The mother who had controlled his entire life, who had pushed him to divorce me, who had orchestrated his rise, had just accidentally signed his financial death warrant. $0. Graham, I said, closing the folder. That is what you leave with. Exactly what you tried to leave me. The final board meeting did not feel like a battle. It felt like a funeral for a dynasty. The room was packed with the independent committee members, the legal teams, and the remaining department heads. I stood at the head of the table, not as the scorned wife, but as the chairwoman of the board. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Graham with anger. I simply looked at the resolution in my hand and read the verdict. Based on the findings of the independent audit, I announced, my voice steady. The board has voted to terminate the employment of Graham Weller effective immediately. The classification is termination for cause. The committee chairperson stepped forward to read the list of infractions. It was a long list. It included the manipulation of quarterly revenue, the falsification of key performance indicators, the theft of intellectual property from the design team, and collusion with the chief financial officer to bypass safety budget protocols. Graham stood up, his face purple with rage. He slammed his hand on the table. I built this company, Graham shouted. You cannot just throw me out. I want my severance. I want my $5 million. I slid the copy of the employment contract down the long table. It stopped right in front of him. You do not get $5 million. Graham, I said, you get nothing. You are the one who insisted on the Weller Clause. You are the one who said we needed to punish dishonesty to protect the family legacy. You wrote the law. Now you have to live by it. Graham looked at the paper, then at his mother. Eleanor was sitting in the corner, pale and trembling. She tried to stand up, smoothing her skirt. This is clearly a misunderstanding, Eleanor said, her voice high and desperate. Graham was misled by bad advice. That PR girl, Celeste, she is the one who confused him. She is the one who— Stop, I said. I projected a final email onto the screen. It was not from Celeste. It was from Eleanor to Celeste, sent 3 months ago. The subject line was stock correction. The body of the email read, "Use the press to drive the price down. We need to force a panic sale." Celeste Rowe realized you were going to scapegoat her, I told Eleanor. So she sent us everything. You were not protecting the company. Eleanor, you were manipulating the market. That is a federal crime. At the other end of the table, 2 officers from the Financial Crimes Division stepped forward. They walked straight to Marcus Dane. The former CFO did not struggle. He looked at the handcuffs as if they were an interesting accounting error, then allowed himself to be led away. He was facing charges for embezzlement and misusing charitable funds. Julian stood up then. He walked over to the table where my handmade Christmas card still sat, preserved in an evidence bag. For the record, Julian addressed the room. The embossed seal on this card is not a decoration. It is a Class 1 biometric authenticator. It was the physical key required to unlock the voting rights of the Umbra Trust. When Harper placed this card on the table on Christmas Day, she was not giving a gift. She was executing a hostile takeover authorized by the will of Irene Sloane. Graham looked at the card. He looked at me. The realization that he had dismissed his own destruction as a craft project finally sank in. Security guards stepped forward. There was no dramatic slap. There was no screaming match. Graham simply looked around the room, realizing he had no allies left. He turned and walked out. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind him. I watched the light on the security panel turn from green to red. His badge was dead. He was just a visitor now. I turned back to the room. The department heads looked terrified, waiting for the axe to fall on them too. "We are going to fix this," I said. "Starting today, we are implementing a credit restoration program. If your name was removed from a project, it goes back on. We are fully funding the maintenance reserve, and we are scrapping the executive bonus system based on stock price. From now on, we reward actual growth, not manipulated numbers." The tension in the room broke. People nodded. Some even smiled. I picked up the evidence bag containing the card. I opened the seal. Everyone leaned in, expecting to see a complex code or a legal decree. But inside, written in my mother's jagged handwriting, was a simple message I had never shown anyone. Revenge burns. Clean justice rebuilds. I closed the card and walked out of the conference room. I did not look back at the empty chairs where the Wellers used to sit. I walked down the hallway, the sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor. They had laughed at me when he divorced me on Christmas. They had toasted to their freedom, but that laughter had just been the sound of them losing everything, and they had been too loud to hear it happening. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on Harper's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.